The rumor started late Saturday afternoon. IDF soldiers operating in the southern Gaza town of Rafah had entered into a tunnel and apparently discovered 6 bodies of hostages, Israelis, who had been taken into Gaza over 300 days earlier on October 7th. As the night went on, names started to leak out. No one wanted to believe that this was real. And then on Sunday morning, September 1st, as hundreds of thousands, millions of Israeli kids were waking up across the country, getting ready to go to their first day of school, the news broke. The names of 4 men and 2 women, 6 hostages, Hersh Goldberg Poland, Eden Yerushalmi, Carmel Gat, Almog Sarusi, Alexander Labanov, and Ori Danino, who had all been alive in captivity for nearly 11 months, had been murdered just days, hours before they were found. They were killed by Hamas just before IDF forces reached their location. On Sunday evening, the Hostage Family Forum had called on Israelis to take to the streets to demand a hostage deal now, and protests broke out across the country. The Histadrut, the labor union in Israel, announced that on Monday morning, September 2nd, it would hold a nationwide strike to also exert and put pressure on the government to reach a deal. If there was a day that was just as bad as October 7th, for many Israelis, it was September 1st. It was the day when the hope diminished, the day that it seemed that these people who were just an arm's reach away, within our grasp, we could have potentially had brought home, had been murdered because we in Israel failed to bring them back, whether through a hostage deal, one that had been in negotiations for months and had remained elusive, or in an IDF operation, which also never was carried out. The soldiers arrived too late to bring back these 6 alive. And the question is, how does Israel move forward? What's next for the remaining hostages still inside the Gaza Strip? Is a deal even possible? What does this do to the country as it continues to prosecute this war? And what does a victory even look like anymore? We don't know what a victory will look like. Can we destroy Hamas? Can we eliminate Hamas? Can we replace Hamas as the ruler of Gaza? And can we even bring back the hostages? And if we don't do one or only do the other, does that even constitute a victory for Israel? On today's episode, I speak with Dr. Seth Frantzman, an old friend of mine, a writer at the Jerusalem Post, a research fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and the author of a new book, The October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. I talked to Seth about the discovery of the hostages in Gaza, what it meant, where do we go from here, but also about his book and what he learned over the last 11 months of covering and writing about this war. Here we go. Seth, great to have you back on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Thank you for having me.
So we're here to talk about your new book, but before we get into that, I do want to talk about the current events that are happening. They always happen in this country at a crazy pace. And we're talking just about a day after the announcement of the discovery on Saturday of the 6 Israeli hostages, their bodies. They had just been murdered maybe a day, maybe 2 before. Hersh Goldberg Poland, Eden Yerushalmi, Carmel Gat, Almog Sarusi, Alexander Lubanov, and Ori Danino, who had been alive in captivity for nearly 11 months before being murdered by Hamas. And I'm just curious, kind of, Seth, somebody who's really been covering this war since the beginning, since day one, and obviously been in Gaza, been down to the border, been all over the place, running around this country and the battlefield, and very closely covering this effort to retrieve the hostages. I mean, how do you view what happened here? What went wrong? And if there is to blame, who is that blame supposed to fall on?
Well, this is obviously kind of the worst possible scenario, which is that they were stuck there for almost a year. So they suffered incredibly. They were found apparently deep in a tunnel underneath Rafah. The IDF has been fighting in Rafah for months. That means that probably IDF troops were not that far away from this area. But as we know, it's very difficult to go in these tunnels. It's next to impossible. So then then to have them killed right before they're found, as opposed to what we've seen in the past, where there were 250 or more hostages taken on October 7th, but we knew that a bunch of them had already been killed and they'd kidnapped the bodies. So in that case, you're recovering bodies. This is just the worst possible turn of events. It's also worse than maybe in a way a raid where you try to rescue the hostages alive and maybe the raid goes wrong and one or two get killed or something, but at least you tried somehow. So it's just awful. The Hamas guys that murdered them got away, apparently. I mean, hopefully eventually they'll be brought to justice or something, but they apparently escaped after killing them. So that's not good. In terms of blame, it's always hard to assign blame. I mean, at the end of the day, the one organization that's to blame is Hamas. And then all the countries and groups that host and back Hamas, which includes Qatar, Turkey, Russia, Iran, China to some extent, probably, and others. So let's start with the real perpetrators. And then, you can go back to the fact that if there's all blame that can be assigned to the fact, Israel let this happen in the first place. The security forces were not on the border in significant numbers enough to stop this. In the end of the day, a country's highest duty is to its citizens. And also, of course, its soldiers. You can't allow people to be kidnapped. And if you do, you have to return them as fast as possible home, like was done at the Entebbe raid. Leaving people in Gaza for years and years, like was done with the Shalit issue, is not, might be not acceptable. So that's you can also assign a bit of blame to the United States, I guess, in the West for pressuring Israel not to go into Rafah. And also, the West did not use all the tools at its disposal to pressure countries like Qatar, who host Hamas, to return these people. I think there's no doubt in my mind, if the West had basically told, Doha, listen, you're going to lose your major non-NATO ally status if you don't return these people, some of them would have been returned. And some of these people were on the list for return. For instance, the women, two of them were women, they were supposed to already be returned back in November.
Right.
And Hirsch was wounded. So I think he was on the humanitarian list. So it's just unacceptable and it's awful.
It's hard for me to disconnect the discovery of the bodies on Saturday to the vote that took place in the Security Cabinet on Thursday night, where apparently the cabinet voted on should Israel leave the Philadelphia corridor, that strip of land between Gaza and Egypt, where we've discovered apparently over 150 tunnels already that were being used for smuggling, or should it remain there, even if that would come at the cost of a deal? And then it gets leaked already on Friday that all the ministers voted against leaving the Philadelphia corridor, except for Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. So kind of on the heels of this vote by the cabinet led by Netanyahu, which basically decided we're not leaving Philadelphia, even though this might prevent a deal. And then a day later, being showed how time is not on our side. I mean, do you see any connection there?
We don't know exactly how the connection works. There is obviously the connection. It happened. The reports were, that it was kind of juxtaposed as the prime minister basically saying Philadelphia is more important than the hostage deal. And other voices like Gallant saying, look, we need to do everything possible to bring these people home because we think there's only 30 or so that are alive and the time is ticking and we have to get them out. It'd be better to do a deal now, and then we could always return to Philadelphia or something. So the timing is bad. I find it strange that the story of, is it plausible that the Hamas guys sitting in a tunnel 12 meters underground, that they're sitting there on the phone with Sinwar and Sinwar saying the deal's not going to happen, kill the hostages? This doesn't make sense because the same reports in our own media say, and other media say, Sinwar is hiding in some other place. He's surrounded by hostages and he only uses couriers. Well, the nature of a courier is you've got to get the guy and get him an envelope. He runs out and he's got to deliver that to some other guy who delivers it to another guy who goes to a tunnel underneath Rafah. So I don't buy the fact that this was done on someone's orders exactly. I mean, the terrorists decided to murder the hostages. They're awful, evil people. I kind of doubt that they got up in the morning and were like, oh, there's probably not going to be a deal. Let's kill them. I assume it's more likely that they saw the IDF above them and were like, oh, we can't get out of here with all these hostages. And they were probably had orders existing. If the IDF is closing in, kill them. So that's kind of my thought process. But in the end of the day, the overall question mark about the ceasefire, whether or not it's better to do the ceasefire or withdraw, and get hostages back slowly over time. And which is better? I've always erred on the side of it would be better to use military force to try to free them, as has been done in several instances. I think that should have been done months ago, a long time ago. I don't like the idea of giving up Gaza and rewarding Hamas after a year of conflict in which they still control it. So from their point of view, they've won, which is not, which
Right.
is not.
What's your opinion, though? There were some people who were obviously horrified. The whole country's hearts broken on Sunday morning with the news of the deaths, the murder of these 6 hostages. But I mean, it's not really surprising, right? The Hamas is a terrorist organization, has been holding these people for 11 months almost in a underground terror dungeon. Every day that they weren't murdered was kind of the surprise, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, in the end of the day, Hamas thought after October 7th that they had taken so many hostages. They thought that they were going to get so much for it. They looked back at the Shalit deal and thought, this is amazing. We got 1,000 people, then we'll get 50,000 now or something. I mean, they just thought they'd hit the jackpot in what they'd done. They didn't understand, of course, is that Israel's a different Israel, and Israel had seen 1,000 people massacred, and Israel was willing, or some part of Israel was willing to allow more losses to take place. Hamas has so many hostages, they probably feel that they can kill a bunch of them, and they can whittle it down tragically to just a few and say, okay, these are the few that are left. Now you need to do something. This is a vicious, evil organization, and again,
Well,
it's backed by Western aligned countries, which is not good.
no. I mean, I totally get your point. That I also totally agree. Not enough has been done, especially with the Qataris throughout the last 11 months, where they're coddled and held up like great allies of the West when they are providing sanctuary to mass murderers and to terrorists. The question though, Seth, is do you see at some point when it comes to the hostages, do you think that there is a military way to get them back, or really at the end there has to be some deal, or it's basically Israel just deciding we're not doing any deal, we're keeping on going, and even if that means we're never going to see these people back home?
Think there's always a military solution. I think in the end of the day, it probably that could have been done earlier. That risks lives, of course, and you risk the lives of operators, the military people, and you risk the life of the hostage. But I think there's always a way to go into a place and slowly surround it. The fact is that this war has not been waged like that. The war was not waged, I don't believe, where that was the main priority. The priority was to destroy Hamas capabilities, which is different than finding hostages.
Right.
That means slowly degrading Hamas battalions or brigades over time, and the hostages are being dealt with on another level somehow. So that's why, for instance, Israel's never gone into Deir Balah, Nusayrat. I mean, not gone in and taken them over, or Burej or Maghazi, the 4 cities in the central camps where it's clear that Hamas just stays there. It's why the IDF left Khan Yunis in April and then went into Rafah, and all the Hamas guys just basically fled back to Khan Yunis, which, if your goal was to squeeze Hamas and find all the hostages under duress, you wouldn't do that. So I think there's always been the feeling that there's a track 2, which is the negotiations. In the end of the day, I believe that pressure on Doha by the West would have secured more of the releases of the hostages. It would have always been difficult to get all of them because Hamas is smart. They understand.
Right.
Hamas understands the longer you hold the hostages and the slower you release them, drip, 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 bit by bit, because that was the kind of deal on the table, was like for 6 months or a year of slow releasing one hostage a week or something like that, something crazy. That was a way for Hamas to spend a year basically celebrating itself and getting its guys to come out from underground with their uniforms and pretend to be an army and pretend to be releasing prisoners in an exchange for what they saw as Israel holding Hamas hostages. I mean, in their weird lingo. So it was always, they always understood that they thought time is on their side. I have no doubt that they were told by their friends in Doha and Ankara and Tehran, time is on your side. Don't release them. Just wait. And they
How do
thought
you
that
yeah
beat Israel down.
how do you view the aftermath in Israel? Obviously, people's hearts are broken. People are devastated. People are in mourning. People are taking to the streets. The Histadrut, the labor union, announcing a strike taking place on Monday earlier today. So how do you view this response by Israel, how it's being looked at by Hamas? So Hamas sees this. They say, hold on, we murdered 6 more Israelis after we murdered so many more ahead of time before this. And now Israelis are back to ripping themselves apart, back to taking to the streets, back to striking. Maybe we can actually push them into civil war. Or, I mean, like, where's Hamas in all of this?
We've heard this narrative for a long time, which is that Israel's enemies look at the democratic Israel and the protests and divisions, and they think it's weak, and they think that their authoritarian regimes are strong. I don't think as a democracy you should get up every morning and be worried that you have internal protest or dissent because the enemy might think you're weak. What you have to do as a democracy is always be prepared externally to behave as strongly as possible in your defense to deter your enemies. The reason Hezbollah is raining down rockets on northern Israel for 10 or 11 months, 7,500 rockets, is not because of protests. It's because Israel failed to deter them. You have to deter these people. Israel can do it. Israel's chosen, unfortunately, not to deter its enemies, and that is another issue that the leadership should be called to question for. The protests are taking place because they desperately want the hostages home. And Israel, I believe the country really owes these hostages to be released. I mean, I think, as I've said, I support a military solution, but I don't think it's acceptable that you have IDF soldiers, the women observers, the Tatzpianot, that they were kidnapped. A country cannot allow its soldiers to be kidnapped. And in the past, Israel was willing to do whatever was necessary, whether it's the Entebbe raid or the tragic Nachum Waxman raid where he was being killed, or the Ma'alot massacre, or those types of things. Israel always showed historically, if you come and you take hostages, we will come in, we will kill all of you, and sometimes hostages also die, but we will do it quickly. And that, by the way, is better for the hostage, because the hostage doesn't want to sit there for 5 years. They'll never recover from that trauma. I think the hostage prefers less suffering as well. So these are difficult decisions. Israel's inability to make the decisions is an issue.
Let me ask you one last question on this topic, and then we're going to move and shift gears. Where do you think Netanyahu is? Because there's obviously a lot of talk. He's against a deal. He prioritizes himself. I mean, I'll tell you my opinion for what it's worth. I think he wants the hostages back. Right? I think everybody wants the hostages back. I just think he wants the war to continue for a number of different reasons. But I think if there was a deal that was a normal deal that did not require prices that were exaggerated, I think he would potentially go for it. But I'm curious what you think.
I think, unfortunately, he's always hamstrung these days by his the political issues. So he always has to get up in the morning and he says, "Well, I'd like a deal," but then he says, "Okay, here's the deal," and then his more far right members of his or government say, "No, no, no, this is unacceptable. We'll leave the coalition." And his thing is, "Okay, well, I don't want to partner now with the center and the left." So, where, by the way, 10 years ago, Netanyahu back in the day, he would have just switched it up and
Yeah.
brought some new coalition partner, and he did that back in the day. He's changed a lot, and he seems to be involved in micromanagement and short-term solutions as opposed to long-term strategy. And he doesn't have that bulldozer instinct of someone like Arik Sharon or even Ben Gurion or whatever, who would have just gone forward and damn the torpedoes, they would have said, and just do whatever it takes. That's the kind of leaders Israel had back in the day. It doesn't have that today. Coalition politics is difficult, and that's where he is, and it's difficult for him.
What an impossible reality. So, Seth, we are here, and obviously, news does trump sometimes what you plan to talk about, but we're here to talk about your new book. And so, congratulations on it. The October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza. Folks, we'll put in a link in the notes to the Amazon link so you can potentially buy Seth's book. I strongly recommend it. Read it. Put up by Wicked Sun, came out just a couple of weeks ago. So, Seth, kind of walk us through for a moment. I mean, you were there. You actually even start with kind of a very personal story, being in Gaza, what it was like waking up that morning. Your son woke you up. Daniel, was it? Was it that one? Or yeah?
Yes.
Cute boy. and the being woken up, the sirens, you immediately dashing down south and doing what you've always done, which is, get to the heat or the center of where the news is happening. But what is the story that your book is coming to tell us?
So as you noted, I mean, I got up that morning and we were woken up by the sirens in Jerusalem, and I guess around a little bit after 8 o'clock in the morning. By that time, the country had already been at war for a few hours. So, I went down there. I didn't think, this is going to be a book or something, but I was covering the war every day for weeks on end, and I was meeting every unit that was being deployed and many of the commanders and police and civilians. And I realized very quickly, this needs to be written down. And of course, people would say, well, wait, but the war's not over. It's true, it's not over. It may not be over for years or decades or who knows what. I mean, the larger picture just never be over. But you could tell the story of the Pearl Harbor attack or 9/11 or the Nazi invasion of Russia called Operation Barbarossa. And you could tell it about the attack itself and look at the first few months. And that's what I thought I would do.
Right.
So that's kind of where the book came from. I also had covered Gaza wars since 2010 or so. I'd been on the border as a volunteer in 2009 for Cast Lead, and I had also, oddly enough, when I was a student, I've been on the border the night of disengagement in 2005. I went down there that night. It was a few protesters. I personally wasn't really protesting it. I was just interested in seeing it. But we went down. We were in Kisifim on the border when they started taking people out. So I realized, I have this decades of experience covering this. I've never put it all in one place. I can write the story about the lead up, and I have all the material about the day itself, or some of the stuff about the day itself, and then the first several months, and what we had to fill in the blanks. There was a lot of material already out there in terms of some of the survivors' accounts and things. So rather than retelling that, I said, okay, I'll try to put that together so it kind of works as a narrative form, and the reader can see how this barbarity unfolded.
What did you, what did you learn about how this came to be and what went wrong in the run up to the morning to 6:29 a.m. on October 7th?
I learned, I think, it was kind of clear to an extent, but I was able to fill in, some of the pictures, some of the pieces of the puzzle, maybe. Just the degree to which large systems like the Israel's intelligence services or security system, large systems that are totally programmed to do one thing, like warn a country of a massive war, can, oddly enough, just like in the Yom Kippur War, can always look at every piece of evidence and just grade it the wrong way and just be like, no, that piece of evidence is not evidence of something bad. It's actually evidence of nothing much. And if you go back and read about the Yom Kippur War, the same kind of thing happened. I mean, two massive armies were massing on Israel's borders, and experts were sitting there being like, "No, this is fine." So, unfortunately, Hamas trained openly for this. It purposely did that. It thought, okay, Israel will just get used to this. And unfortunately, we learned a lot about how Israel didn't listen to low-level soldiers like the women observers, which calls into question, why would you deploy dozens or 100 unarmed women observers in the IDF on the border a few meters from Gaza and not listen to them if they're telling you the enemy is walking up to the border and taking pictures and stuff? Well, what's the point of having them there? Why would you endanger their lives? And B, why even have them if you don't want to listen to them? So it's so much of a breakdown of a system. I was astounded to find out, I guess, how few soldiers were deployed along a 40-mile front line. I mean, the overall numbers, I guess that all this will come out exactly in the final reports, but we're talking 500 to 700 combat soldiers. We're talking just a dozen or so functional tanks. There's no reserves. There's no artillery. There's no helicopters. The helicopters were in the north. And this, by the way, I've covered a lot of wars. It wouldn't have been this way 2 decades ago when Israel had a much bigger army.
Okay, intelligence agencies obviously failed, but they were buying into some misconception, right? They were buying into some fairy tale. How did that fairy tale take hold? As you said, Hamas openly, this is kind of like we've all heard the word misconceptia. We all know, like from Yom Kippur War, then they believed war wouldn't happen. Now he believes Hamas was deterred, would not attack in the way it did, but then it did. But how does that even happen to an intelligence agency, which is meant to constantly question and challenge and rethink and see that they're training, as you said, just over the border, simulating how to attack me, and me to say no, it's all okay? How does that happen?
I think it's the multi-layers, three aspects. And I'll just go through it. There's arrogance. The Israel was arrogant. It was complacent. It was focused in the wrong place. And so the fourth one, probably, I think Israel was lured into failure. Let's not forget the enemy does something as well. The enemy, Hamas, and its backers abroad, who are very sophisticated, Iran and Doha and Turkey and others, they did information warfare here. They worked to basically lure Israelis to Israel's leadership into kind of being asleep at the wheel, and they
Right.
were telling them Hamas is deterred. Just give Hamas millions of dollars, no big deal. So first of all, let's remember the enemy moves as well. It's not a chess game against ourselves. That's one thing. Israel was arrogant. We know that. Any of us who have covered military stuff, whether it's in Israel or any other country, knows that military security people tend to always think they're right, even though the goal is, yes, they're supposed to always be suspicious. But we know intelligence systems just become incredibly arrogant. That's just
Yeah.
unfortunately how things work. And we also know that Israel was focused on what it called the third circle threat, the Iranian threat. Had all sorts of fancy technology and AI and all this stuff. It thought it can deal. It basically thought, I can fight Hamas with my pinky finger over here, and I'll concentrate on the big bad wolf of Hezbollah and Iran, and they are a big bad wolf. But you should never ever just ignore something festering problem, and we did, and it's awful. I think in Jewish history, this will be remembered as one of the great worst massacres. I mean, I assume, just like we remember, well, Purim didn't end up that way, but it could have. I mean, so we'll just remember this for a very long time. And this is a tragedy. I hope we learn from it, because if we don't, it'll happen
Then
again.
then it has the potential to repeat itself.
Yeah.
Excuse me. You have a whole section in the book about the ground offensive in Gaza,
Mhm.
how it was prosecuted, how the IDF went about and did it. Lots of controversy, right? I would say on kind of two different levels for the most part. First being, I mean, the Israeli military so advanced, so technological, so many more, tanks, fighter jets, drones, Golani and paratroopers and the best trained soldiers. So one is we're 11 months in, pretty much 10 months if you include if you take away the first month of the war when we weren't on the ground inside Gaza. So why is it taking so long? And number two, people are very critical around the world of the casualty toll that we've seen in this war, which, if we are to believe the Gaza Health Ministry, aka Hamas, is already at about 40,000 people, more or less, who have been killed in this war. So break down, if you can, for me, please, these two issues that we hear. You probably hear them a lot from people. I hear them a lot from people.
So it's a classic issue that an army faces, which is you always train for the wrong war and last war, right? If you're there before the Second World War, there were armies like the French. The French army, by the way, that deployed against the Germans in 1940, they had on paper the same number of men and tanks and stuff and planes. I mean, they should have been fine. And it collapsed like this.
Yeah.
People with mistakes. The American army that went into Vietnam was a very good army. It wasn't nothing wrong with it. It had lots of experience. Uh, they just couldn't win, and they didn't know how to win, and they were hamstrung, and they made all sorts of mistakes. So the IDF, unfortunately, is an army that has all sorts of tech, lots of tanks and stuff. It did have problems in the beginning of the ground offensive because it hadn't trained for this kind of war. It had lots of units, but it actually had scaled back the number of tanks and infantry and stuff, and it had focused too much on special forces and things like that. But nevertheless, they called up 300,000 men. They had enough to go in. They were very cautious. They didn't want to lose very many troops. They wanted to wage a slow war, which is totally the opposite of the IDF doctrine of momentum, which was designed to wage a fast, quick kind of lightning war with masses of technology. Bizarrely enough, they didn't know how to do it in Gaza. They didn't have the plans. They dusted off basically the 2009 Cast Lead plan and thought, well, that might work. So they went into the north first, allowing Hamas to run away. Then they went into Khan Yunis. Hamas ran away again. Then they finally went into Rafah, which I think lots of people assume they should have done first. It's been a slow plotting war. It's very precise.
Do you
Not very
think they
many
should have
soldiers, IDF
done
soldiers
the
have died.
north? Do you think they should have gone from the north and the south at the same time? And the now, kind of as you analyze it,
probably they should have they could have done that, but B, they should have gone into Philadelphia first, probably, then gone into Khan Yunis, which is the hometown of Sinwar, and just found him and killed him. I mean, at the risk of hostages, probably, and then tried to end the war quickly. They should have just gone into the north and the central camps and taken over the whole thing. They shouldn't have. What unfortunately, I think we know that the hostage discussions and the U.S. pressure and humanitarian issues and so many things came to bear, and just the general look. We have to remember, the government of Netanyahu is a very cautious government. So it's not an Arik Sharon type of government. It's not the Moshe Dan. It's not 1967. It's very, very cautious. The brass, the IDF chief of staff and the brass, I think, are people who came of age in the 90s and early 2000s. Their experience of war is the Second Intifada. They also want to manage a conflict a bit. Despite the fact that they had a doctrine that says everything will be fast, I think when given the Gaza problem, they were very cautious. Now you could say that's great because maybe it saved thousands of Israeli lives, that caution, at the expense, though, of perhaps a long war, which in the end, lots of people suffer. So it's not always, maybe in 1967, war is better. And you also asked about the casualties of the
yeah.
which I didn't. I purposely said in the book, it's not about that side. I'm not going to go into all that that much because I don't know enough about it, and someone else should tell that story. But yeah, they claim 40,000 killed. Israel claims 20,000 of those are fighters, so 20,000 are probably civilians. That's a lot. It's a huge number of civilians, way too many. I think when we look at the numbers, we find out the 2 or 3 weeks of the heavy bombing campaign in October, when Israel still didn't know what to do in terms of the ground offensive, and what they did was just use a lot of heavy bombing. I think that killed a lot of civilians, and maybe didn't kill that many quote unquote militants or terrorists, whatever. Once the IDF got going in December in Khan Yunis, and they sent the 98th Division full of commandos and paratroops and elite units, once the IDF began fighting the war it wanted to fight, which took a few months, I think, by the way, the number of civilian casualties has gone down to, I don't know if it's near zero, but it's close. Every time you hear about these quote massacres or whatever, it always turns out to be nonsense in the last few months. The most recent was they said Israel struck humanitarian convoy and killed 5 people, and then you find out that they're all gunmen. So we have to remember that the Hamas-controlled health ministry just always lies and never admit
their MO is lying, right?
Right. They never admit anyone is a Hamas member. So from their point of view, they're all civilians, and Israel has to do the hard work of being like, yeah, but actually they're not all civilians.
I remember in the beginning there was something with one of their charts. It was like only women and children who were being killed, as if no men. There's either no Hamas men being killed, and there's also no non-combatant men in Gaza, because no men get killed.
It's obviously nonsense. I mean, even if Israel, even if Israel was waging a very badly managed war, like it was waging a war the way Russia wages a war in Ukraine, basically, if it did that, which it doesn't, you'd expect women and children to be killed, but not only them. It's just obviously nonsense. The IDF works very, very hard not to kill women and children and civilians. I think there was a learning curve, and over time, IDF got better. Over time, the Palestinians, we noticed them in Gaza. Now when Israel says evacuate this neighborhood, they evacuate.
Yeah.
Beginning of the war, when Israel said evacuate all of northern Gaza, they were like, no. And I'm sure Hamas told them to stay, and maybe at gunpoint, by the way. So, that's what's changed.
There were reports like that. Seth, like myself, you have a bit of a what's the term, should I say, an affinity or a passion for military technology. We share that together. You wrote a great book called Drone Wars, which I strongly recommend to people, kind of just about the use of how drones have really taken over combat. And by the way, the war right now is a perfect example. What we're seeing every day in northern Israel, Hezbollah's sophisticated use of drones. which we also have to admit Israel has difficulty countering, identifying, detecting, and then intercepting those drones, unlike the rockets, despite knowing that this threat, I mean, that's a whole other story that one day will have to be kind of looked into a bit more, is how do we miss that? But I am curious, Israel being at war now for 11 months, pulling out everything, using all its advanced technology, using almost all its arsenal of different weapons. What did you see new on the battlefield? I mean, you mentioned some use of AI, artificial intelligence, and some of the strike targeting groups that were created by the IDF and the Shin Bet for parts of this war, searching and hunting down some of the terrorists and using for some of the targeting. What caught your eye in the use here?
Well, I mean, maybe it's kind of the opposite. I think what caught my eye as someone who, I mean, when I was young, my teen years, I wanted to be a military historian. I was fascinated by the Greeks, the Romans, Russians, everyone. I mean, I love military history. So I guess actually what interests me more is the fact that we always learn the same lesson, which is that technology is not a magic wand. It's important, and it can win wars when made in mass, right? Like in the Second World War, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They used aircraft carriers. That was like a whole new thing. They didn't win the war, actually, despite having kind of pioneered that a bit. The Americans did. Why? Because the Americans built a lot more aircraft carriers. So you have to use the new technology, but build a massive amount of it. And Israel has kind of, Israel is trying to roll out all these precision weapon systems like the Iron Sting mortars and things. All this stuff is really smart technology. It can be used to reduce casualties and make, infantry battalions or whatever much more effective, because you don't have to rain down a bunch of artillery and destroy a whole area. You don't have to wait for an hour calling in airstrikes that never happen. You have a drone just sitting there. So that's interesting. But I think maybe what I've learned is the opposite, which is I love all this technology, but in the end of the day, it's still about all the people on the ground. And it's still about, you have to go in and eliminate the enemy and its leadership and take control of the ground. And we're seeing in the war that Israel relies a lot on the technology and these precision strikes, but thousands of precision strikes against a whole bunch of random commanders apparently doesn't win wars. So far, Hamas didn't collapse. So we have to wait and see. And I'm concerned because I see what happened in the north with Hezbollah. I don't think the proportional precision strike responses Israel's doing and relying on air defense, I don't think it's a strategy. So maybe what we learn as people who are interested in military tech is that the technology is never a substitute for strategy, and you have to have a real strategy. And I guess we could go back to the Greeks fighting the Romans or whatever, and Hannibal and whatever, and we'd learn the same thing. Hannibal was a brilliant commander. He could not defeat the Romans, and I think we've learned that lesson again and again.
Seth, we're coming towards the end, and I just want to ask also. I think it kind of ties back to the beginning a bit of our conversation about the hostages, but also, of course, about the war. Because one of the big things I feel to some extent is we're all kind of grasping at straws. What does Israel really want here? Right? We talk about complete victory, total victory, and you kind of touch upon this also in the book a bit. We're all a bit skeptical. Like, what does this mean? Right? We've been degrading Hamas, and I think the IDF has done a pretty good job. Right? We've seen a mobilization of reservists, impressive, good use of technology. Overall, the war is being prosecuted in an effective way. But really, it has to lead to something, right? And that seems to have been elusive, definitely since the beginning of the war. And I would even say now, what is that strategy? What is that goal? What does the victory look like for Israel? To say the elimination of Hamas, what does that really mean? On the other hand, how does it tie back into the hostages? Because getting hostages back home, that's a potential victory. But that we didn't, that we're also now missing out on. So when you kind of look at the full picture after 11 months, to some extent, where do you see, what is victory in your eyes? Not Bibi, Seth Frantzman.
Yeah, I'll tell you, in the book itself, I wanted to let the reader look at that a bit and allow the soldiers and civilians to go and speak for themselves. I didn't want to put too much of my own self into this or what I think. But ask that question. I think that, in my view, Hamas should have been totally destroyed in Gaza. It should be erased from the entirety of Gaza. It should be replaced probably with the Palestinian Authority, in my view, which is what's it, the worst bad thing you could have, or something, least bad thing, least bad option. So some sort of Palestinian Authority backed by some of the international community, the ones that are not involved in backing terror. Hamas should be totally erased. Its leaders should be hunted down and killed. The Israel should have demanded early on that the U.S. get the Hamas leaders out of Doha and force them to go to some place like Beirut or Tehran, where they could then be hunted down, which would be the best possible scenario. So that's what needs to happen. I believe that, it doesn't mean that you have to occupy Gaza forever. You go once you've got them out, and you begin to replace them bit by bit, then maybe something else appears. But you have to be willing to go the distance in the beginning, pay the hard price to get there, and then maybe hold on to Philadelphia and slowly withdraw or whatever. But you cannot allow Hamas to control the battlefield at the end of this war. That's a disaster. It's unacceptable. It would not be good for Israel. It weakens Israel and allows Israel's enemies like the Houthis and Hezbollah, who are all chomping at the bit for the next front, to think, okay, this country is just weak. We'll just keep attacking it. Israel's given up way too much in terms of that, allowing Hezbollah.
And by the way, I'll just add maybe one other element to what you're saying is we can't go back to burying our head in the sand either, right? We're going to have to continue to operate against Hamas and to mow that terror lawn, if I borrow a term.
But I just want to
Second
uproot
Intifada.
I don't want to mow it. I just want to uproot the whole lawn and replace it with a whole different type of species. Like, I want to get rid of the grass and put cactus. I want it done. I think Israel needs to do a knockout blow against one. Israel's fighting a whole bunch of enemies in a ring, right? And Israel right now is just kind of ducking like Muhammad Ali, right? He was always dancing, but it's like, okay, but now's the time for the knockout blow. One of these enemies has to be totally defeated to send a message. If we just keep waiting, our enemies only get stronger. And you know what? A strong country like Israel, when you fight a weaker enemy for a long time, your chances of getting weaker is much greater. They have less to lose. And that's just the reality. And Israel has to just make a decision.
Well, on that positive note, Seth, congratulations again on the book. To our viewers and listeners, grab yourself a copy. You can find it, the October 7th War, Israel's Battle for Security in Gaza, by Seth Frantzman, my good friend. Great to have you with us on the podcast. Thanks for joining us, Seth.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode. You can find us always on where podcasts can be found, on Apple and Spotify.